On the 9th of October 1872, they buried a miner named Song Wen with the ink of his own name barely dry in the district register. Dry, because the recorder had already scratched a line through it before the funeral supper went cold. His widow stood at the grave in a borrowed strip of black cloth, the only mourning the dry goods store kept in a size for a Chinese woman's grief. Before sundown that same day, a claim recorder, a syndicate of jumpers, and a sheriff who shrugged and called it a civil matter had already settled what would happen to her, certain, every one of them, that a Chinese widow could neither hold 40 feet of gravel nor read the law that was taking it from her. Everyone at that counter expected her on the Sacramento coach by Sunday morning. What she did before first light instead, and the one neighbor at Feather Bar who would not put his name to her ruin, turned a fresh grave into the most disputed ground in the district. The recorder's window at Feather Bar closed at 6, and Otis Pruitt liked to clear his book before supper. Song Wen's claim, number 41 on Copper Gulch, sat unworked exactly one day since the timber gave way in the Excelsior Company's shaft and buried him under rock he himself had written a warning about. Pruitt did not look up when she came to the counter. He spoke past her, to the man beside her, the way a man discusses a mule he is thinking of buying. The wife, if she was that, won't hold it, he said. Chinese don't stand as witnesses to their own marriages in this county, let alone their claims. Cole Bonner at his elbow already had a location notice drawn up, the ink barely older than her husband's grave. She said nothing. She had learned, in 6 years on this creek, that the first useful thing a woman in her position could do was listen without her face changing and remember every word spoken over her head as if it had been spoken to her. That night she did not weep where anyone could see it. She sat by the stove in the cabin Song Wen had built with lodgepole and patience, and she took down the book he had kept on the shelf above the door. Not a Bible, not a ledger, but the Feather Bar District's own mining bylaws, bound in scuffed brown leather. He had read it to her line by line for 3 winters, tracing the English words with a blackened fingernail while the fire burned low, until the letters stopped being shapes and became a language she owned as surely as her own. Nobody at that recorder's window knew she could read a word of it. She meant to keep it that way a little longer. By lamplight she found the clause she needed. Forfeited ground, she read again, may be relocated by any person performing the required acts. And she understood, for the first time since the shaft caved in, exactly what the next 4 hours of darkness were for. Before the sky over the Sierra Ridge had gone from black to iron gray, Song Hua walked back to the ground that had buried her husband, carrying 2 new posts, a hammer, ink, and paper folded inside her coat. She would drive those posts herself, build a monument of stones with her own hands, and write a notice no recorder could pretend not to understand. She did not know yet that a quiet neighbor named Elias Ward was already awake in his own cabin, watching her lantern cross the flat, and that he would refuse, within the week, to sign the one paper that would have ended this before it began. She did not know the shape of the fight still coming, the cut rope, the flooded drift, the hearing room, her husband's hidden notebook. She knew only the law, the dark, and the 40 feet of gravel that was rightfully hers to claim again. On the morning it happened, Song Wen ate his rice cold because the fire had not been worth building for the 20 minutes he had before his shift. He worked 2 claims at once that autumn, his own 40 feet on Copper Gulch, staked with Song Hua the year they came up from the Feather River placers, and 4 days a week in the Excelsior Consolidated's company shaft, paying down, timber by timber, the debt he owed Yarnell's Mercantile for flour, boots, and the winter before. He did not want to go down that morning. He had told the shift foreman, a heavy man named Dysart, twice in writing, that the ground past the second station was rotten, that the vein ran contrary to the heading they were driving, and the rock above it had no business holding a drift that wide. Dysart had filed the letters in a drawer and told him the company paid by the foot, not by the worry. Song Wen kissed his wife's hair before he left, the way he did most mornings, and told her, half joking, that the mountain owed him nothing yet. The Excelsior's whistle was not supposed to sound before noon. When it did, 3 short blasts and a fourth that trailed off wrong, every man on the flat above ground stopped what he was doing and started running toward the headframe. Song Hua was at her own claim, 40 feet up the gulch, washing the last of the morning's gravel through a rocker she had built with her husband's hands guiding hers. She heard the whistle and knew its wrongness in her body before her mind caught up to it. She dropped the rocker's handle and ran, skirts gathered, past men who did not step aside for her, and past men who did. At the collar of the Excelsior shaft, a crowd had already gathered, and the cage was going down empty and coming up with timber, broken rock, and nothing else. Nobody would tell her which crew was below. She stood at the rope line with her hands pressed flat against her own ribs, as though she could hold something together by holding herself together, and she waited the way she had waited for letters from Guangdong, knowing, before the knowing was official, what the answer would be. They brought him up a little after 2 in the afternoon, and the men who carried the stretcher would not meet her eyes, which told her more than any of them said aloud. Song Hua knelt in the mud at the shaft collar and did what her mother had taught her to do at such a moment, and what no one in Featherbar had ever seen a woman do in public before. She did not scream, and she did not faint, and she did not look away from her husband's face. She held it between her 2 hands the way she had held it every night for 6 years, and she spoke to him in Cantonese, low and steady, words the miners standing at a respectful distance could not understand, and did not try to. Someone murmured that it was strange, a woman so quiet over a dead man. Someone else murmured that quiet was not the same as nothing. Both of them were watching her. From a distance they did not close, the way people watch weather they expect to pass without touching them. The message came before Song Wen's body was even washed and laid out on the boards Elias Ward had, without being asked, plain smooth that same afternoon. A boy from the recorder's office, no older than 12, delivered it at the cabin door with the particular discomfort of a child sent to do an adult's unpleasant business. Mr. Pruitt requested her presence at the claim office before 6 o'clock, the boy recited, stumbling slightly over the memorized words, regarding the disposition of claim number 41. Song Hua understood every syllable of it, including the ones the boy did not understand himself. That disposition meant they intended to dispose of something, and that 6 o'clock on the very day of her husband's death was not an accident of scheduling but a decision, made by men who knew grief slowed a person down and had chosen the hour precisely because of it. She washed her face, put on the black ribbon a neighbor woman had pressed into her hand that morning, and walked the half-mile into camp before the light could fail her. Otis Pruitt did not invite her to sit, though there was a chair against the wall reserved, ordinarily, for men filing paperwork. He kept the counter between them like a fact of geography. Cole Bonner stood at his elbow with 2 other men Song Hua recognized from the Excelsior's day shift, all 3 dressed like they had come prepared for a transaction rather than a morning. Pruitt opened the district book, ran his finger down a column and spoke, as he had the evening before, to the men in the room rather than to her. "Claim's been unworked since yesterday morning," he said. "District rule's plain. 48 hours unworked and it's open ground. I don't make the rule." Bonner slid a paper across the counter, already signed by 2 witnesses, declaring the ground abandoned and relocated in his own name. Song Hua read every word of it upside down, faster than any of them expected a woman to read anything, and said nothing yet, because she had learned that the moment to speak was rarely the first moment they gave her to speak in. She found Sheriff Coyle outside the mercantile, leaning against the porch post with the unhurried posture of a man who had never once in his career been late to anything that mattered less than a fight. She asked him, in English clean enough that he blinked once before answering, whether a claim could be declared abandoned on the same day a man died performing labor on it. Coyle turned his hat in his hands and told her that mining disputes were civil matters, that the recorder's book was the recorder's business, and that if she had a grievance the proper place for it was a district hearing, which convened, he added, only twice a year, and the next one was not for 11 weeks. He was not unkind about it. He was simply, entirely unmoved, the way a fence post is unmoved by weather. Behind him, through the mercantile window, she could see Yarnell totaling a column of figures that included, she knew without asking, the debt her husband had died still owing him. Nobody in that street intended to help her. She had not expected them to. By the time she left the recorder's office, the light had gone, the deep orange it took on over the Sierra Ridge in October, the kind of light that made even a rutted, mud-choked camp look, briefly, like something worth a painting. She walked the length of the main street with her chin level and her eyes forward, past the assay office and the 2 saloons and the tent where a preacher held services every third Sunday, and she was aware, without turning her head to confirm it, of every conversation that dipped lower as she passed and rose again once she had gone by. She heard once, clearly, a man tell another that the Chinese widow would likely take the Sacramento coach come Sunday, now that there was nothing left up the gulch to hold her here. She did not correct him. She filed the sentence away with the rest of the day's evidence, the way her husband had taught her to file a survey line, not for anger, though there was plenty of that, but because a person who intended to win an argument needed a record of exactly what the other side had said. The cabin, once she was inside it with the door shut and the last of the daylight gone, was smaller than it had ever been, and louder with his absence than any silence had a right to be. Song Hua did not light the second lamp. She sat at the table where they had eaten 1,000 meals together and opened the wooden box under the bed frame that held what little a miner accumulates that is not tools: a comb, a folded letter from his mother in Toisan, a pouch of dust from his very first claim, weighed and never spent, because he liked to keep it as proof the mountain had once said yes to him. At the bottom, wrapped in oiled cloth, was the book she had known would be there, because she had watched him wrap it the same way every night for 3 years before setting it on the shelf. She did not open it yet. She held it against her chest, the way she had held his face at the shaft collar, and she let herself, finally, alone, cry. He had started teaching her in their second winter, not out of any grand design, but because the fire needed feeding through the long dark hours, and neither of them could sleep past 9, and a district's mining bylaws, it turned out, were the only book on the whole creek that circulated freely enough for a Chinese miner to borrow without comment. He had traced the words with a fingernail blackened permanently by iron and rock, sounding them out slowly, and she had watched his mouth as much as the page at first, learning the shapes of English sounds before she learned the shapes of English letters. Discovery, location, assessment, forfeiture, words that meant nothing and then, gradually, meant everything, because they were the words that decided whether a family like theirs kept the ground it had bled for. He used to say, laughing low so as not to wake the camp, that a woman who could read the district's own rules better than the recorder who enforced them would never be entirely without power, whatever else the country took from her. She had believed him. She still did. By the time the fire had burned down to coals, she had read the relevant pages 4 times, and the 4th reading had not changed what the first 3 had told her. The Feather Bar District's own bylaws, written and adopted by a miners' meeting a decade before any federal act reached this creek, said nothing about the sex or the nationality or the marital proof of a locator. They said, in language plainer than Pruitt had ever been plain with her, that forfeited or abandoned ground could be relocated by any person performing the required acts: discovery, boundary posts, a monument of stones, a written notice recorded within 10 days. Nothing in the text required her to be a widow the law recognized, or a wife the county had ever bothered to record. It required work, it required paper, it required her to move faster than Cole Bonner's 10-day clock, which she now understood had already started running the moment Pruitt struck her husband's name from the book. She banked the fire, laid out 2 new posts by the door, and did not sleep. She left the cabin an hour before first light, with the 2 posts balanced over one shoulder, a hammer and a bag of nails in the other hand, and a small tin box holding paper, ink, and a stub of pencil tucked inside her coat, against her ribs where she could feel it with every step. The camp was silent in the way mining camps are only ever silent between the last drunk stumbling home and the first cook fire being lit, and she moved through it like something the town had not yet decided to notice. At Copper Gulch, the old workings sat exactly as the men had left them the day before. The original corner post Song Wen had driven 3 years earlier still standing, weathered gray, one of them leaning where a mule had once brushed against it. She set down her load at the discovery point, the flat stone slab where the first color had ever shown itself to them, and she stood there a moment in the cold, listening to the creak, before she picked up the hammer. She measured the way he had taught her, pacing off the district's required distance along the vein's apparent strike, driving the first new post at the northeast corner with 6 clean strokes of the hammer, each one landing exactly where the last had landed, because a wandering strike wastes a woman's strength she cannot afford to waste twice in one morning. The wood was cold and slightly damp with the night's frost, and her palms, unused to a full morning's hammering after weeks of gentler rocker work, split at the base of the thumb before she had finished the second post. She did not stop for it. She wrapped the hand in a strip torn from her petticoat hem and kept driving posts at the southwest corner, then the 2 remaining corners the bylaws required for a claim of this shape, checking each distance against the pacing count she had memorized the night before. By the time the sky over the ridge had gone from black to the deep blue that comes just before color, all 4 corners stood driven, square, and true, exactly as the law described them. The monument came next, and it was, in its way, the harder labor, because stones the right size did not simply present themselves at the discovery point. She had to walk the gulch bank in the half-light, testing weight against her split palms, carrying what she could and dragging what she could not, until she had enough to build a cairn 3 feet high at the claim's center, wide at the base and narrowing the way her husband had built the one at their original discovery 3 years before. She remembered, stone by stone, the shape of his hands doing this exact work, remembered him explaining that a monument was not decoration but evidence, proof, standing in the weather long after paper had rotted or burned, that a person had stood on this exact ground and claimed it in the plain sight of anyone who cared to look. She set the final stone, a flat gray piece the size of a dinner plate, on top of the cairn as the sun cleared the ridge at last, and the light hit the new-turned earth around the posts like something almost deliberate. She unscrewed the tin box, unfolded the paper, and wrote the notice standing up, using the flat-top stone of the monument as her table, because a location notice written sitting down, her husband used to joke, always came out crooked. She wrote her name as the district's own conventions required it to be written, Song Hua, widow of Song Wen, locator, and beneath it, the boundaries she had just paced and driven, the date, and the plain declaration that this ground, claim number 41, Copper Gulch, Feather Bar Mining District, was located and claimed under the bylaws of this district by the person signing below. She read it over twice for any error a hostile clerk could seize on, folded it into the tin the way she had seen dozens of notices folded at the recorder's counter over the years, and wedged the tin under the flat stone at the top of the monument where any passing miner, friendly or not, would find it without needing to ask her permission to look. Then she stood back, hands raw, and looked at what she had built. The first person to see the new posts was an old placer miner named Silas Deakins, who worked a claim 2 gulches over and had a habit of walking the long way into camp each morning to check the state of everyone else's diggings before he checked his own. He stopped at the edge of Copper Gulch, squinted at the fresh-driven wood catching the early sun, and stood there long enough that a second man, coming up behind him with a mule, had to ask what he was looking at. Deakins did not answer right away. He walked the boundary once, slow, the way a man reads a sentence he does not quite believe, and then he laughed, not unkindly, more the laugh of a man who has just watched something impossible happen in front of him and cannot yet decide what to do with the fact of it. By the time he reached the assay office, the story had already outrun him twice, growing new details with each telling, but the core of it stayed the same wherever it traveled. The Chinese widow had staked her dead husband's claim back before the sun was fully up, and she had done it exactly, precisely, maddeningly by the book. Cole Bonner heard it at the mercantile counter, where he was buying tobacco he did not particularly want, and the color that came up his neck was not the color of a man amused. He rode out to Copper Gulch within the hour, his location notice from the day before still folded in his coat pocket like a hand he intended to play again, and he found Song Hua kneeling at the base of the new monument, tamping earth around the last post with the flat of her palm. He did not dismount. He told her, from the height of the saddle, that a woman's stake meant nothing without a man's name behind it, that the district would laugh her paper out of the book, and that she would save everyone trouble by riding out on the Sunday coach while there was still time to do it with some dignity. Song Hua stood, wiped her hands on her apron, and told him, in English precise enough to make his jaw tighten, that the district bylaws he had cited to her the day before said nothing at all about dignity, and everything about deadlines, and that his own 10 days were already running. He laughed at that, the way men laugh at things they have not yet decided are dangerous, and asked her, mockingly, to name the section she meant, certain the question itself would be enough to end the conversation. Song Hua recited it without pausing to think, the way a person recites something they have read by firelight 40 times over 3 winters. Article the 4th, forfeited or abandoned locations, relocation by any person performing the required acts of discovery, boundary, monument, and recorded notice within 10 days. Bonner's certainty flickered, just slightly, and he covered it by spitting into the gravel and telling her that Pruitt would never record a Chinese woman's notice regardless of what the article said. That, she told him calmly, was a different problem than the one he had just raised, and she intended to solve it in its own time, in its own place, and not on horseback in front of a monument he had ridden out here specifically to intimidate her away from. He wheeled his horse and rode back toward camp faster than he had ridden out, and she understood, watching him go, that the fight had only properly begun. Over the following 2 days, Bonner and his partners made a project of the camp's saloons, buying rounds and collecting signatures on a fresh declaration. This one asserting, over multiple names, that Claim 41 had shown no sign of the deceased's labor for a full week before his death. An assertion 3 separate men who had worked alongside Song Wen knew to be an outright lie, since he had been down that very shaft on company business only because his own claim was, in fact, keeping him solvent enough to pay Yarnell's account. Most signed anyway. A miner's credit at the mercantile was a fragile thing, and Bonner made it known, without ever quite saying it aloud, that men who declined to sign might find that credit harder to come by. Song Hua heard about each new signature within hours, the way news traveled through Feather Bar faster than water down the gulch, and she recorded each name in a small ledger of her own, not out of vengeance but because her husband had taught her that a lie, once written down by its author, becomes a fact a court can be shown. Elias Ward was the 11th man Bonner approached, and the only one who did not reach for the pen. He had worked the claim adjoining Song Wen's for 2 years, close enough to have heard, more than once, the two of them laughing together over the evening cookfire in a language he did not speak, close enough to know, with total certainty, that no man who worked a shaft 4 days a week to pay off a store debt could reasonably be called a man who had abandoned his other claim. He told Bonner, in a voice that did not rise and did not need to, that he had watched Song Wen work that ground with his own eyes not 4 days before the collapse, and that he would not put his name to a lie for any amount of goodwill at the mercantile. Bonner reminded him, pointedly, that refusing cost a man friends in this camp. Elias said that was a fair trade for keeping the ones worth having, folded his hat brim back down, and walked out of the saloon without buying anything, leaving 11 names on the paper instead of 12. He came to Copper Gulch the following dawn, before Song Hua was properly awake, and left a mallet leaning against the base of her monument, a good one, iron-headed, better balanced than the hammer she had borrowed to drive her posts, the kind of tool a man keeps for himself and does not lend out casually. He did not knock at her cabin door. He did not wait to be thanked. By the time she came out to start the day's work, he was already 50 yards up his own claim, back to her, splitting timber for his shaft with the steady rhythm of a man who intends to be seen doing exactly what he says he is doing and nothing else. She picked up the mallet, turned it once in her raw hands, and understood it for what it was. Not charity, which she would have refused, but the plainest form of respect a quiet man in this camp knew how to offer. A good tool, left where it would be needed, by someone who had watched closely enough to know precisely what she lacked. The shaft itself needed timbering before she could safely go below the 12-foot mark, and this was work she had watched her husband do 100 times without ever having done it herself, since a wife's hands, in their arrangement, had belonged to the surface, the rocker, the sluice, the cooking fire, while his belonged to the dark. She set the first set of timbers the way she remembered him setting them, cap piece resting square across 2 upright posts, wedged tight against the country rock with shims driven in from both sides until the wood took the weight of the ground above it, rather than merely standing beneath it. Her first attempt sagged within an hour, and she pulled it down and rebuilt it rather than trust her life to a compromise. Her second held. By the end of the 3rd day she had 4 full sets in, spaced the interval he had always insisted on even when it slowed him down, and she went to sleep that night with sawdust in her hair and a soreness in her shoulders that felt, for the first time since the funeral, almost like accomplishment rather than grief. Alongside the shaft work, she kept the rocker running at the creek every afternoon, washing the tailings her husband had never had time to finish processing, and the district bylaws required exactly this kind of documented, dated labor to defeat any later claim that the ground stood idle. She kept her ledger faithfully, hours worked, timber set, gravel washed, a small pinch of color weighed and recorded each time the pan showed any, because a court, she understood now with total clarity, did not care what a person felt about their own diligence. It cared only what a person could prove. Twice that week other miners passed along the gulch trail and stopped to watch her work the rocker, saying nothing, and she let them watch, because witnesses who saw the work with their own eyes, unbidden, unpaid, were worth more to her case than any paid signature Bonner could collect at the saloon. She found, on the Thursday, a thread of color richer than anything the claim had shown in months, and she recorded its weight in her ledger with a hand that did not shake, though her heart, for just a moment, did. She walked into Pruitt's office on the 10th day, exactly as the bylaws allowed and not 1 hour past the point where his own clock would have run out on her, and laid the location notice, her work ledger, and a witness description of the monument on his counter in that order. Pruitt read none of it with any pretense of interest, flipping the pages the way a man flips through a newspaper he has already decided holds nothing worth his time. He told her the filing was irregular. She asked him, evenly, to cite the specific bylaw it violated, and watched him search the book on his own shelf for a clause that did not exist, because she had already checked, twice, that none did. He could not find one. The district rules, whatever his own opinion of who ought to be allowed to use them, required him to record any notice properly filed within the statutory window, and after a long silence in which his jaw worked without producing words, he took the paper, stamped it with more force than the stamp required, and entered Claim 41 into the book under the name she had written. It was on a Tuesday night, deep enough into the shaft that her candle threw more shadow than light, that her hand, running along a loose board she meant to nail down properly before winter, found a gap behind it that should not have been there. She worked the board free and pulled out a small, oilcloth-wrapped notebook, thicker than any tool a miner would ordinarily carry below ground, and her first thought, absurd even to her in the moment, was that her husband had hidden a second set of accounts from her, the way some men hid whiskey or debt. She carried it up into the last of the evening light before she opened it, some instinct telling her this was not something to read by a single candle in a hole in the ground. The handwriting on the first page was his, small and careful, dated nearly a year back, and the heading at the top of the page was not a household ledger at all. It was a survey, angles, distances, a rough sketch of rock strata, and beneath the sketch, underlined twice, a single sentence that made her sit down where she stood. The sentence read in his own hand that the true vein beneath Copper Gulch and the Excelsior ground ran nearly perpendicular to the heading the company was driving, and that continuing to drive west, as Dysart insisted on doing, would carry the shaft directly beneath a fault of broken, water-softened rock that no timbering short of solid cribwork could safely hold. She turned page after page and found the survey developed further with each entry, dated across nearly a year, showing her husband had not stumbled onto this by accident, but had worked it out deliberately, patiently, the same way he had worked out the English language for her by the fire, measurement by measurement, note by note, building a case out of small true things until the whole picture stood undeniable. He had drawn the actual vein as it truly ran, gold-bearing and rich, curving southeast beneath ground the company had never bothered to test, because their own foreman was certain, without evidence, that the metal lay due west. Her husband had known, for the better part of a year, exactly where the real fortune in that mountain lay, and he had told no one but this book. Further into the notebook she found copies, in his careful hand, of 2 letters he had written to Dysart directly, dated 4 months and then 6 weeks before the collapse, laying out in plain language the danger of the western heading and requesting, formally, that the company either crib the shaft properly or abandon that direction of work entirely. He had kept a record of Dysart's response to the first letter, 3 words scrawled at the bottom in a different, cruder hand, paid by the foot. There was no record of any response to the second. Songhua sat with the notebook open on her lap long after the light had gone fully from the sky, understanding now with a clarity that turned her grief into something harder and more useful that her husband had not died in an accident of nature. He had died because a company that paid men by the foot of tunnel driven had chosen, twice, in writing, to ignore a warning from a Chinese laborer they did not consider worth listening to, and had then sent him, 4 days a week, into the very ground he himself had told them not to touch. She understood, too, reading the dates against her own memory, that the forced shifts against the store debt had placed him underground on exactly the days Dysart chose to push the western heading fastest, which meant Song Wen had gone down into ground he knew to be unsafe, not out of ignorance, but because refusing meant Yarnell calling the debt due in full, in a season when calling a debt due on a man like her husband amounted to a different, slower kind of violence. The anger that moved through her that night was not the wild, weeping kind she had felt at the shaft collar. It was quieter and colder and considerably more durable, the kind of anger that does not need to shout because it has already decided exactly what it intends to do with itself. She rewrapped the notebook in its oilcloth, carried it back down into the drift, and hid it again behind the loose board until she could decide the safest way to bring it into daylight, because she understood, now, that whoever had let those letters go unanswered would not welcome this notebook seeing a courtroom. The rope went first, on a morning cold enough that her breath hung visible over the windlass, while she checked the knot before her first descent, the way she checked it every single morning without exception. It held her weight for the first 4 feet and then parted cleanly, not frayed but cut, a clean diagonal slice through hemp that did not fail the way hemp fails from wear. She fell only those 4 feet, catching a timber set hard enough to bruise her ribs and knock the breath from her entirely, but 4 feet, she understood clearly even through the pain, was not the distance the person who cut that rope had intended her to fall. She sat in the mud at the bottom of the short drop for a long moment, cataloging the injury the way her husband had taught her to catalog any setback, what is broken, what still works, what needs doing first, and then she climbed out on the timber sets themselves, hand over hand, and examined the cut rope end in the gray morning light, already certain of what she would find, and exactly who would deny knowing anything about it. Elias found her sitting at the shaft collar with the severed rope coiled in her lap, and he did not ask if she was hurt before he saw for himself, kneeling to check her ribs with the brisk, impersonal competence of a man who had set enough broken bones on this creek to know the questions to ask. Satisfied nothing was worse than bruised, he picked up the cut end and studied it in silence for a long moment, the way he studied most things before he spoke about them. A knife did that, he said finally, not a wear point, and not an accident, and he did not need to say the rest of what both of them were thinking for it to sit plainly between them. He walked the ground around her windlass, found nothing that told him a name, and told her, quietly, that he intended to start sleeping closer to his own line after dark, near enough to hear if trouble came to hers again. She did not thank him in words. She handed him one end of a new coil of rope and let him help her rig it, and that, between the two of them, was thanks enough. The water came a week later, diverted from the upper fork of the creek sometime in the small hours by hands she never caught in the act, and by the time she climbed down at first light, her lower drift stood nearly 2 feet deep, the timber sets she had cut and set with her own hands, standing half submerged, and the loose gravel of 3 days' washing swept into a useless gray slurry. She stood on the last dry timber for a long moment, exhausted before the day had properly begun, and felt something close to despair reach for her the way it had not managed to reach her since the funeral. Then she picked up a bucket. She bailed for 6 straight hours, hand over hand up a rope ladder she had rigged for exactly this purpose, dumping each load at the surface and climbing back down for the next. And somewhere in the 3rd hour, Elias appeared without a word and took the ladder's other side, doubling the pace, and by dusk the drift stood dry again, the timber sets checked and sound, and the two of them sat at the shaft collar too tired to speak, watching the last light go. It was Elias who raised the idea first, 3 days after the flood, standing at the boundary line between his ground and hers with his hat in his hands, in a way that told her, before he said a word, that he had rehearsed this. He told her that a second claim staked alongside hers, filed properly, with its own posts and its own monument and its own witnessed labor, would mean twice the eyes on the ground and twice the hands to defend it, and that he was not offering charity, because he intended to work it and take his fair share of whatever it produced. He wanted her to understand, he said, watching her face carefully as he said it, that the terms would be hers to set, not his. Her claim came first in the district book. Her husband's survey had found the true vein, and any man who thought he was rescuing her by staking beside her had misunderstood, entirely, what kind of partnership he was proposing. She looked at him for a long moment in the cold morning light, and then she asked him, plainly, what share he thought was fair, and let him answer that question before she told him hers. They drew up the papers at Elias's table 2 evenings later, by lamplight, with a notary Elias had ridden 4 miles to fetch, specifically because the man had no history with Bonner or the Excelsior, and no reason to slant a document either way. Song Hua wrote the terms herself, in her own hand, because she trusted no one else's phrasing on a document that would need to survive a hearing room full of men inclined to read ambiguity as an opening. Equal shares in whatever the ground produced, joint responsibility for labor and expense, her name listed first as senior locator, and a clause, her own addition, stating plainly that nothing in the agreement altered or diminished either party's individual claim, as separately recorded in the district book. Elias read it twice, signed it without argument, and told her, with the closest thing to humor she had heard from him yet, that he had never in his life seen a partnership contract written so carefully to survive a fight, and that he supposed she had learned that particular skill, the same place she had learned everything else that kept surprising this camp. Bonner's next move came through a lawyer rather than a horseback confrontation. A thin, careful man named Ferris, retained by the Excelsior's owners in Sacramento, who arrived at Song Hua's cabin door with an offer of $200 for the claim, payable immediately, and a quiet suggestion that a formal legal challenge to her standing as a locator, on grounds of marriage never recorded under American law and citizenship never granted, would be considerably less pleasant for her than simply accepting the money. Songhua listened to the entire offer without interrupting, the way her husband had taught her to let an opponent finish saying everything they intended to say before answering any of it. And then she told Ferris, in the same even English she had used on Bonner and Coyle and Pruitt in turn, that the district bylaws under which her claim was filed said nothing whatsoever about marriage records or citizenship, only about discovery, boundary, monument, and timely notice, all four of which stood recorded in Pruitt's own book under his own stamp. Ferris left without the claim, but he left too with the unmistakable understanding that this particular fight was headed for a hearing room. With the hearing date finally fixed, less than 3 weeks off, Songhua spent every evening at the table organizing what she had into a case a district judge could not easily dismiss: the original location notice, her ledger of hours and ounces, the witness description of the monument, Elias's sworn account of Song Wen's continued labor in the days before his death, and, wrapped carefully at the bottom of the box, the notebook, which she had decided, after long deliberation, to bring forward in full, whatever risk it carried, because a negligence a company had committed in writing deserved to be answered in the same medium. Elias helped where he could, riding to fetch 2 more men willing to testify to the shaft's condition, and Silas Deakins, of all people, offered without being asked to describe under oath exactly what he had seen the morning he found her posts already standing. She practiced reading the relevant bylaw aloud each night until the words came without hesitation, because she understood that in a room built to doubt her, hesitation would be read as evidence of exactly the thing they wanted to believe about her. The district hearing room in the county seat was crowded past its benches the morning the case was called, word of the dispute having traveled far enough down the Feather River country that men had ridden in from 3 camps over simply to watch. Songhua sat at a table with Elias beside her, and the notebook and ledger stacked squarely in front of her, aware of every eye in the room and the particular quality of the whispers that reached her regardless. "The Chinese widow," several voices said, as though widow were the operative insult and Chinese the explanation for why it was permitted. Cole Bonner sat across the aisle with Ferris and 2 Excelsior representatives sent up from Sacramento specifically for this morning, and Otis Pruitt occupied a chair near the judge's bench, called as a witness to his own recording of events, visibly unhappy to be there at all. Judge Alden Rook, a spare, unhurried man known on the circuit for reading every document placed before him twice before speaking, gavelled the room to order and asked, without preamble, who intended to speak first for the locator of claim number 41. Songhua stood, and the room's whispering did not entirely stop, but it thinned considerably, curiosity briefly outweighing contempt. She did not begin with her husband's death, though every eye in the room expected her to, playing for sympathy the way a lesser advocate might have. She began instead with the book itself, the district's own bylaws, open to the page she had marked, and she read Article the 4th aloud in a voice that did not waver and did not hurry. Forfeited or abandoned locations may be relocated by any person performing the required acts of discovery, boundary, monument, and notice, filed within 10 days of relocation. She paused, let the silence hold a moment, and then told the room plainly that nowhere in that sentence, nor anywhere else in the district's rules, did the word surname appear, or the word nationality, or the word husband. The rule required work done and deadlines met. She had brought, she said, documentary proof of both, and she invited the court to examine it on its own terms, rather than on the terms the men across the aisle preferred to argue instead. She entered the location notice first, then the ledger of labor with its dated entries and weighed ounces, then the witness description of the monument, letting each document build on the last the way her husband had taught her a survey should build, fact upon fact, until the shape of the whole ground became undeniable to anyone willing to look. Elias testified next, plainly and without embellishment, to having seen Song Wen working Claim 41 himself only 4 days before the collapse, directly contradicting the 11 signatures Bonner had gathered at the saloon. Then, last, she brought forward the notebook and read aloud, without dramatics, her husband's own survey of the true vein and the 2 letters he had written to Dysart, warning of the exact rock that had ultimately killed him. The room went very quiet, in a different register than before. Not contemptuous quiet now, but the quiet of people realizing a dead man had, in his own careful handwriting, predicted precisely how he would die, and had told the company responsible, twice, in writing, in time to prevent it. Judge Rook read the notebook's relevant pages twice, as was his habit, and then looked up at Ferris and the Excelsior men with an expression that had shifted, visibly, from procedural patience to something considerably harder. He asked Dysart's employers, through Ferris, whether the company disputed that these letters had been received, and Ferris, after a long consultation in whispers, admitted that the company's own files, subpoenaed the week before at Elias's insistence, contained copies of both letters with Dysart's handwritten notations still on them. The judge then turned to Pruitt and asked him, directly, to explain the 48-hour rule he had cited as grounds for declaring the claim abandoned within 1 day of a man's death, and asked whether that rule appeared anywhere in the district bylaws Pruitt himself was sworn to administer. Pruitt, under direct questioning, could not produce the rule from the book, because it did not exist there, and existed only in the version of the district's customs he had chosen to enforce selectively when it suited men like Bonner. The room's whispering had stopped entirely by the time he finished failing to answer. Judge Rook did not take long to deliberate once the testimony closed. He ruled from the bench that claim number 41 had never lawfully been declared abandoned, that Songhua's relocation, performed in strict compliance with every requirement of Article the 4th, stood as the valid and controlling location of record, and that Cole Bonner's competing notice, built on testimony now proven false by 11 witnesses' own prior statements, was void and struck from the district book entirely. He ordered Otis Pruitt to correct the record personally, in his own hand, entering the claim under Songhua's full and correct name rather than any abbreviated or borrowed version of it. And, in a final ruling that drew an audible sound from the Excelsior men's side of the room, he found the company liable for negligence in the death of Song Wen, given clear documentary evidence that the danger had been reported in writing and ignored twice, and ordered an indemnity paid to his widow in an amount the room repeated to each other in disbelieving whispers long after the gavel had already fallen. The ride back to Feather Bar took most of the following day, and Songhua spent a good portion of it saying almost nothing, the exhaustion of the hearing finally catching up to weeks of grief and labor she had not allowed herself to fully feel until the outcome was secure. Camp had already heard, by the time they arrived, word traveling faster on horseback than any coach, and the change in the street was not dramatic, but it was unmistakable. Men who had murmured about the Sacramento coach a month earlier now nodded to her as she passed, not from warmth exactly, but from the particular respect a hard place reserves for anyone who has beaten it fairly at its own rules. She walked into the recorder's office one final time to watch, in person, as Pruitt corrected the district book, his pen moving slower and more carefully than she had ever seen it move on her behalf before, entering her name in full where an abbreviation had stood, striking Bonner's voided notice with a single firm line. He did not apologize. She had not expected him to. The correction itself, standing permanent in the book, was apology enough for her purposes. Weeks later, with the worst of the fight behind them and the true vein her husband had found beginning, at last, to show real color under Elias's steady work and her own, the two of them fell into the particular quiet rhythm of people who have been through something difficult together and no longer need to fill every silence with talk. He still called her Mrs. Song, out of habit as much as respect, the same two words he had used the very first week, before either of them had known what the other was capable of. She had stopped minding it somewhere in the middle of the flooded drift and the cut rope, understanding it now not as the erasure it had once felt like at the recorder's counter, but as something closer to the plain, careful courtesy of a man who did not use anyone's name loosely. They worked the claim together most afternoons, her ledger open on the flat monument stone, his timber sets holding steady overhead, and the mountain that had taken her husband from her had begun, slowly, to give something back in a currency that was not only gold. It was Elias who finally asked, on an ordinary evening with nothing particular to mark it, sitting at the shaft collar, while the light went down over the ridge, the way it had gone down the day the whistle first sounded wrong. He turned his hat over once in his hands, the same gesture he had made the morning he proposed the partnership, and told her that the whole camp called her the Chinese widow, and he had called her Mrs. Song since the week her husband died, and he realized, saying it aloud, that in all this time he had never once asked her what her own mother had called her before either of those names existed. Song Hua looked at him for a long moment in the fading light and told him, simply, Hua, a small word, spoken aloud in that place for what felt like the first time it had ever mattered to anyone but her husband. She did not tell him that evening what the notebook's final pages held, words she still read alone by lamplight and had not yet decided belonged to anyone else. And he did not tell her in turn why a man so plainly unafraid of hard ground had not gone down another man's shaft in the 6 years before hers, a silence between them that neither one, that evening, felt any need to fill.